invite you to take your Bible and turn to the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 13. We're going to read that passage together. We're so glad you're here. Very grateful for this occasion. Darren mentioned a minute ago about the meeting announcement. I'd like to add a word of thanks to Jeff for designing that for us and getting that printed. That's no small job. And getting that mailed out, that's an important job, and we want to have folks come to our meeting and know about it. You might notice on here that he has put the times for Sunday evening and then Monday through Friday, and that's not a mistake. We're going to meet Sunday morning, Lord willing, on that day, but the meeting will begin Sunday night. I think we've already explained that. The date that we could have it was a date that really ended the meeting in Northwood, and so Brother Seth was going to come over after that and be with us on that Sunday evening. So I do hate that we had that hiccup, but I'm glad he's able to come for the rest of the time. He's an outstanding student and a good guy, good family, and I think he'll do us a lot of good. We do want folks to come and to be with us, and so we want to emphasize this with our neighbors and friends and post it wherever you want to post it. But, of course, the main thing is this is our meeting, and we want to be here for our meeting and sacrifice to be here for our meeting. We'll be the winners if we do that. And I hope and pray that that'll be our intention. Pray for this meeting, to make plans for this meeting, to come with an open mind for this meeting, and to come to be changed. Come to be made better by hearing the Word of God. So I'm excited about it, and I know you are too, and we're looking forward to this time together. 1 Corinthians 13 is another familiar passage. 1 Corinthians 13, and help if I plug this in. I put it up here, the old translation. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. Though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profits me nothing. Charity suffers long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunts not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeks not her own, is not easily provoked, thinks no evil, rejoices not in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Charity never fails. And he ends this segment with this great statement in verse 13. Now abide faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. Because that's the one that lasts even beyond this life. And after this life is all burned up, after faith and hope have been lost in fruition. You know, when the Lord comes back, there won't be any more hope. There won't be any more faith. But there will be charity. And so he says it's the greatest of the virtues, charity. You know, whenever you read the old translation, sometimes people are prone to say, well, you know, that's a poor translation. The word really is love. The word really is agape, isn't it? That's the Greek word. And it is translated by many modern translations by the word love. But as a fellow smarter than me pointed out, and when you think about that word charity and its use, agape and its use, charity is a great translation of the word agape. It is the idea of someone who is willing to give and sacrifice for the need of another without any thought of something coming back to him other than the fact that they need it and we give it. That's what charity is, isn't it? When you see somebody in desperate need and you help them out, you don't think, well, they'll probably help me out here tomorrow. They're probably never going to be able to help me out of the way I've helped them. But you do it anyway. And I think that's really the essence of this word. Now, the word love that is sometimes offered in substitute for it is really such an abused word that it almost has no meaning. We've talked about this many times, but, you know, love, is there any word less meaningful in the English language than the word love? Love. I love my mama. I love chocolate. I love to go fishing. The same word. Surely not the same meaning, the same thought behind it. And so if we talk about abused words, love is a terribly abused word. But this word is a high word. The word the Holy Spirit chose is a noble word. And I think charity fits it pretty well. How important is it? You can see by reading the text how important it is. Doesn't matter what you do or what sacrifices you make. If you give your body to be burned, but this is missing, it's nothing. It's nothing. Every time we read that, I think it just washes over us the power of that statement. Lest we be confused about the importance of it in God's view. When the Lord was asked, what are the greatest commandments? What's the greatest commandment? He gave you two, didn't he? What's the greatest commandment? I'm not asking you to answer out, but you know the answer to that. Thou shalt love, same word, the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and mind. And the second's like it unto it. Thou shalt love, same word, thy neighbor as thyself. If we're not people who exhibit charity, love in our life, then we're not in fellowship with God. If anything could be more plain than that, I don't know what it would be. This is where the golden rule comes into this picture. Whatsoever you would that men should do unto you, do even unto them. Love is about doing. It's not just a feeling, and it's certainly not a natural feeling. It's a choice that we make to help those who are in need in some way. Maybe what they need is not a dollar. Maybe they just need some mercy. Maybe they need some guidance. But love, charity, is that spirit. Romans chapter 13. This is a great passage where we find this virtue showcased. And Paul, in this letter on salvation, he'd been talking about how that we are, as Christians, called on to live in a world in which there's civil government, human government. And he said, let me tell you what you ought to do as a Christian. You ought to pay your taxes. And he said, for that matter, you ought to pay every debt you owe. But he said, there's one debt you never will really pay off. Verse 8, the old translation reads, owe no man anything but to love one another. For he that loves another hath fulfilled the law. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love works no ill to his neighbor. Love is the fulfilling of the law. That passage has been greatly abused. This one has. People have the idea, well, if you just feel loving, then you don't have to sweat the details about being obedient. No, that's not what he's saying, is it? What he's saying is if you understood what charity really is, and you applied that in your life, there would be no room for it. There's no way you're going to work ill to your neighbor by taking his wife, by taking his life, by taking his things, by taking his honor. You wouldn't dream of doing that for somebody that you have charity toward. That's his point. If that foundation is there, the rest of it, avoiding the rest of it, will be easy. Charity is the foundation. And I think about that in reference to the church. You know, I've admitted to you before, 1 Peter chapter 1, I don't know how many times I read this verse before the power of it really came to my mind. But Peter, he is writing about Christians. He says, you have purified your souls in obeying the truth. There's a connection between obedience and being pure. Right. Through the Spirit. If we didn't have the word of the Holy Spirit, we wouldn't know what to obey. But the next phrase is the one that I think I overlooked for a long time. Unto. This is the preposition eis. It's a preposition of movement. Toward. It's the same one in Acts chapter 2 and verse 38, be baptized for the remission of sins. I'm here and I want to be over there, remission of sins, be baptized unto remission of sins, into remission of sins. So apply it here. You purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit unto unfeigned love of the brethren. And that's right. You know, one of the reasons why God saved you is so you can love your brethren the way they ought to be loved. That you can have that spirit of charity and that life of charity toward one another. Does that change the way I look at my brethren? Does that change the way I look at my service to God? You know, why are we saved if it's not to be examples of charity? It's a matter of will and a matter of action. And as far as application is concerned, where does it not apply? You know, this is a great wedding passage, and sometimes it is read at weddings. I've at least done that through the years. I'm not the first one by any means. This chapter of 1 Corinthians 13 on charity, doesn't that apply? But it also is the answer, I think, to churches that are torn up by strife. You think churches could be so damaged if charity was at work in every member, including me? You have problems at work. Where does it not apply? The spirit of charity. It's of surpassing importance, as we've already talked about. It's the essential. And it's described in our text in both positive and negative ways. There are things that charity demands and things that charity forbids. So I want to look one more time at this lesson from the Holy Spirit on the need for charity. And positive and negative. We're not going to be able to exhaust this list or to say everything that ought to be said. We'll say a few things in the time we have. And let me just add this too. As far as I know, this is preventative. I don't sense we're at each other's throats. But I think maybe that's a great time to talk about these things. I'll tell you one thing. If the devil has his way, we'll have everybody at each other's throats. We'll have everybody with suspicion and hatred and bitterness toward each other. Charity won't allow that. If God is ruling in my life, it's not going to be that way. So let's talk about some things charity is according to our text, back 1 Corinthians 13. Charity is patient. I think that's seen in several, if we were to group together several of these precepts concerning charity or these descriptions of charity, I think they fit under the broad heading of patience. For example, verse 4 of 1 Corinthians 13, charity suffereth long. This is that word in the Greek language that literally means long-temperedness. I think about that passage in Matthew chapter 18. In Matthew 18 and in verse 26, this is the word that was used. Remember that story the Lord told about the two debtors? He was a king and he found out that his servant had wasted millions of dollars. Just a hopeless debt here. And his plea was, be patient with me and I'll pay thee all. Because that same fellow, after he found forgiveness, ran off and treated with great contempt one of his fellow servants, owed him a small amount. And the Lord made quite a point about that. But anyway, what he's asking for is just bear with me. Suffer along with me. Don't give me what I deserve. Be merciful to me. It's the same word that's used over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 14. Paul there toward the end of this letter exhorts the brethren this way. He says, warn them that are unruly, comfort the feeble-minded, support the weak, be patient toward all men. And that's our word, long-suffering. Long-temperedness, a long holding out of the mind. I think of that in reference also to the word for bearing all things. The word here, likewise, I think fits this idea of patience. The word stego in the original language is actually closely associated with the Greek word for roof. Can you see the connection between the two? What does bearing all things have to do with the roof? Well, think about your pro roof. You know, when there's a storm, who gets all the rain? Who gets all the hail? Who bears up under the heat? You know, the roof protects everything else. It bears under all the abuse that the weather can dump on it. And so that's the word that Paul used, for example, in 1 Corinthians 9. When he writes about his interaction with the Corinthians. He hadn't taken support from Corinth. And some folks said, well, that's because he's not really an apostle. He just feels guilty. That's why, you know, if he were really an apostle, he'd take money. And Paul said, no, I didn't take money because I didn't want anybody to say that I was preaching for money. It's not wrong to take money for the work of preaching. And he makes that point here. But he said, I got my support elsewhere. I went to that trouble. I bore that for your good. Verse 12. If others be partakers of this power over you, are we not rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. We bear under. The word there, suffer, is the word stego in the original. You know, sometimes you just put up with things. Sometimes you just bear under the load. Sometimes you go the extra mile. Sometimes you do what, I don't have to do that. Why should I have to do that? Well, because you have charity in your heart and it needs to be done. I think about another term that might fit this same category. That is, endure all things. Very similar thought, different word there. Upomone is a word which means to bear under, literally. To abide under. To hang on. It's the word that's used over in Luke 2. You remember this story. This is the story about Jesus, one of the few stories we have about his youth. He was about 12 years old. His family went to Passover in Jerusalem. Nothing uncommon about that. Well, they came back, or started back, but Jesus wasn't with them. He remained behind in Jerusalem, and they found him later on in the temple. You remember talking and asking questions with the doctors of the law. It's interesting, the word here is the word macrothumia in verse 43, has it in our text here. Tarried behind in Jerusalem. And you get that idea. Family left, but he hung in there. And so he did, and so he would. That kind of spirit, sometimes you just hang in there with people who need your patience and who need your love and your charity. In the book of James, the first chapter, and in verse 12, blessed is the man that endures temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. He just hangs in there. The question of fellowship, how long should we abide with someone is a question that I've been trying to figure out all my life as a Christian. It is a difficult question sometimes. I remember asking an old wise brother years ago a question something like this. I asked him, how long should you hang in there with somebody? Is there a breaking point? I think sometimes there has to be a breaking point at some point. But how long should you hang in there with someone? And his response, I'll never forget. He said, as long as you can. That's simple and profound at the same time. As long as you can. There's some differences that we cannot abide. There's some things that drag me into the sin this man is committing, and I can't do that. But as long as you can abide with him, abide. Show patience, long-suffering, endurance, bear all things. Patience with one another. Isn't that what the Lord displayed in his work constantly? This is a broader illustration than I can try to give in full, but I just drop in the middle of Matthew. Just about anywhere you go in the story of the gospel, if you look for it, you'll see Jesus exercising great restraint in talking to his disciples. Let me make this point. I am in no way belittling these great men, the apostles, the disciples the Lord chose. They were giants. They were great men. And I'm not worthy to clean their shoes. But they grew in their knowledge and in their service and in their attitudes. There's no question about the fact that all these men who at one point died for the cause, at another point as young men were, well, I'm just going to tell you, they wore on the patience of the Lord. I think that's evident as you read the story. Chapter 14, this great story when, verse 15, when it was evening, Jesus had been teaching, and it's a desert place, and the time is now past. And so the disciples say to the Lord, send away the multitude that they might find something to eat. Aren't you glad that the disciples remembered people need to eat? I'm sure the Lord hadn't thought about that. Isn't that wonderful of them to, well, I don't want to be too sarcastic, but, the Lord used this opportunity. He said, well, I tell you, you give them something to eat. He said, we don't have anything here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. He said, make them sit down. And he gave thanks, and he took that bread and he multiplied it. And he fed 5,000 men, plus women and children. And the baskets they took up of fragments were 12 full, large baskets. The Lord taught them a lesson there. In the same connection, that story goes on. He sent the disciples on. He remained behind. And then at some point, as a storm came up over the Sea of Galilee, as it is wont to do, the Lord then came to his disciples. He didn't have a boat. He just walked on the water. And as he walked on the water through the rain and the lightning and all that was going on there, the disciples, who were very fully engaged at 4 or 5 in the morning, trying to keep their boat from filling up with water, look over here, and through the lightning they see Jesus walking to them, but they didn't recognize him at first. They just saw something. And so, what did they say? They cried out and they said, it is a spirit. And they cried out for fear. Now, the word spirit there is not the normal word like pneuma or suke. It's the word phantasma, which is the word for ghost. Maybe yours says that. Ghost. It's a ghost. Well, I know this is a really unusual situation. Let me grant all that. But, if Rodney and I decide to go camping out here, and he wakes me up and he says, I think I just saw a ghost, I'm going to think less of him. I have to admit to you, I think better of him than that. I don't think he's going to do that. And I think probably as the disciples look back on this years later, they must have thought, why would we think that would be what would be out there on the water? I mean, you wouldn't expect anybody to be on the water, but why would we use that word? Why would we think that? But the Lord, he's patient. So he comes to them and he comforts them. And you remember Peter said, well, Lord, let me come to you. Come. And he starts out and then he begins to sink because he became afraid. And the Lord caught him and said to him, O thou little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? That was an occasion, wasn't it? You think you'd remember. And the Lord dealt with him so gently and so patiently. Chapter 15 tells the story about his enemies that came to him and said, why do you eat with defiled hands? Your disciples eat with defiled hands. And Jesus said, why do you defile the word of God by your tradition? And he got on them pretty hard. In vain do you worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. What Isaiah wrote is about you. And maybe I'm reading here too much, but it seems in verse 12, well, in the first place, the disciples were told, it's not what goes, hear and understand, it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a man, it's what comes out of the mouth that defiles a man. I don't think they understood that. Furthermore, they seem to be rather upset that the Lord, or embarrassed that the Lord had fussed at the Pharisees like that and sent them with their tail between their legs. The disciples came and said, knowest thou that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? But the Lord did not blast them. He did tell them rather bluntly. He said, let them alone. These folks are blind. They want to be blind. The blind lead the blind, they'll fall in the ditch. Leave them alone. And they said, well, what did you mean by this? What comes into the mouth is not what defiles. He said, verse 16, are you yet without understanding? Every once in a while you get that sense, don't you, that the Lord is working with them here. And he explains what he meant by that. So the next story, they come to Syrophoenicia, and they come to this, there's this woman who comes to them and says, Lord, help me. My daughter is grievously vexed with the devil. And the Lord answered her not a word. Now, sometimes people read this story and say Jesus is being mean to this woman. I don't believe that for a moment. I think the Lord knew exactly what he was doing. He was drawing something great out of this woman. And ultimately, he answers her request. What I find more disappointing is the disciples' reaction. They said, Lord, send her away. She cries after us. I tell you, I've said some pretty dumb things in my life. So I can relate to this. You think back sometime later, maybe months later, maybe years later, and you just cringe and you think, why did that come out of my mouth? I don't think they were proud later of this day, of this moment. It was a learning experience for them. And the Lord taught both this woman and the disciples something about mercy and about the gifts of God. Well, the Lord, just one story after another. So what do you find in chapter 15, verse 32? The Lord's been teaching and healing, and he said, the Lord speaking now, verse 32, I have compassion on this multitude because they continue with me now 3 days and have had nothing to eat. I will not send them away fasting lest they faint in the way. And the disciples said, look at what they said in verse 33. Whence should we have so much bread in the wilderness as to fill a great multitude? Now, I like to be optimistic, and I'm just going to assume that what they meant was, Lord, we can't fix this, but you can. But the way it comes across is like, have you forgotten already what he did in feeding 5,000? How many loaves do you have? 7 this time. Tell them to sit down. And the Lord blesses the bread, he takes it, and he breaks it, and he feeds 4,000 men plus, and was it, how many baskets full? 7 baskets full? Different size basket, bigger basket. Well, chapter 16. And here the Pharisees and Sadducees say, show us a sign. Jesus said, show you a sign. I've done nothing but show you a sign. It's amazing how you can see the sky and tell whether it's going to rain tomorrow or not, but you can't see the signs of the times. No sign given but the sign of the prophet Jonah. And then he told the disciples, he said, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. You remember this story? And it just so happened that day they had forgotten to buy bread. And so they think, he said, leaven, bread. He's mad at us because we didn't buy bread. That's what this is. We forgot to buy bread. I told you to buy bread. And the Lord says to them, really? Do you not remember what I did for 5,000 men? And for 4, you think I'm mad because you don't have bread? You think that's what I would be concerned about? And then they understood, verse 12, how that he spake not concerning the leaven of bread, but the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. This is the same chapter where Peter speaks up. God bless him. Whom do men say that I am? Whom do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of God. Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah. You listen to God to learn this. And then he continues and says, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and be killed and raised the 3rd day. And Peter said, no, that won't happen. You're the Son of God. Let me tell you your business. It ain't going to happen. No. Peter was told by the Lord, get thee behind me, Satan. You speak not the things of God, but the things of men. And then he goes to be transfigured up in the mountain, Peter, James, and John. When he comes down, the other disciples have failed to heal a man because of their lack of faith. And we could just go on, but let me read one more in chapter 18. Just page after page, you can tell if you look for it, how the Lord is discipling the disciples and how much patience he took with them. And this is so typical. I can relate to this. Then Peter in 18:21 speaks up and says, now, Lord, let me tell you, it's hard to be patient with people. So how often do I have to forgive a guy? How many times I got to put up with a guy? Oh, man. Yeah, it is hard, Peter. No, not 7 times. Try 70 times 7. He didn't say it, but he might have. He said, that's how many times I've had to put up with you. And I can be so impatient with people. And the Lord is saying, I've had to be mighty patient with you, Wesley. When you talk about charity, one aspect of charity is patience. And in every arrangement, we could be talking about a marriage. You know why a lot of marriages, there are other reasons, but a lot of times marriages fall apart simply because you don't have patience. You have expectations for others that are different than the expectations we have for ourselves, and we get angry and people just quit. You know what's going on in the world. That's a lot of it. Just a lack of charity. It could be true in the church, certainly. Congregations that are damaged no little because there's not the patience. Think about how the Lord bore with and over time worked with the weaknesses of and developed the strength of these 12 men. And think about how the Lord has been patient with me and working with me for a lot longer than 3 years. And then think about how I can take that blessing and I can make use of it in dealing with everybody else. I think it's a great lesson. And if every congregation is dominated by a spirit of charity, I didn't say compromise the truth. I just said charity. And I feel like that'll be the kind of spirit the Lord expects to see among his people. There's another aspect of this, though, we want to mention. Charity is kindness. That's what he said in verse 4. Going back to our text now, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4. Charity is kind. Christuomai is the word there, big old word, which suggests the idea of graciousness, well disposed to the service of others, merciful. Going back to the golden rule, somebody said kindness is applied consideration. We talk about being considerate of other people. You have to apply it for it to be real. If you're really considerate of other people, you're going to be acting like it. And it's a unilateral commitment, by the way. This is not a reciprocal thing where we say, well, if you treat me right, I'm going to treat you right. The Lord over and over again taught that lesson. Luke chapter 6 is one of the places he taught it. Love your enemies. Do good to them that hate you. Bless them that curse you. Pray for them which despitefully use you. Learn to turn the other cheek. Give. Even to those who take, give. For if you love them, verse 32, that love you, what thank have you? Sinners love those that love them. Christians have charity. Christians have charity. And again, if we had more time, we could just look at countless examples from the life of the Lord showing this. That's the thing. I think it really, 1 Corinthians 13 comes alive more to me when I think about how Jesus applied these things. We've seen how patient he was. We also see how loving he is, how kind he is, even toward those who hated him. You say, love your enemies? That's not easy to do. The Lord would say, yeah, I know. I was on a cross when they were spitting at me and cursing my name. And I said, Father, forgive them. I know all about how hard it is. That's what I want you to do. That's who I want you to be. Charity is optimistic. Back to our text in verse 7. Charity believes all things, hopes all things. we were talking about this earlier, one of the helps, I think, in reading the Bible. We're talking about going through our Bible reading, and sometimes you run across phrases that are puzzling. Sometimes the simplest way we can help maybe clarify our understanding is to have a copy of a number of different translations. And so as we look at other translations, sometimes we can get an idea that maybe helps us to see more clearly. In the International Standard Version, believes the best in all. There is no limit to her hope. I like Mr. Moffat, what he wrote. He translated this, always eager to believe the best, always hopeful. That described me, by the way. Eager to believe the best. I think I've met some folks eager to believe the worst. That if a word is said or an action takes place, I have a way of assuming and asserting and applying the worst motive to what that fellow did or said. And it spirals into an ugly spirit. What Moffat said is that Paul is teaching us to believe the best. He's not praising gullibility. He's not saying that we ought to be naive, but he's saying as long as possible, until proven otherwise, believe the best. Now, some people prove out to be swine. That's what the Lord said. There are some that are just swine. Don't cast your pearls before swine. But he would call on us to believe the best about people. Make people prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt. Charity is opposed to the cynicism that says, well, I tried once, Luke chapter 22, among other places, we find, I think, this same spirit being demonstrated by the Lord. Jesus knew that Peter would deny him 3 times. He predicted that, but he also said, and when you're converted, go and strengthen your brethren. I think about what the Lord did with a more amazing story in the 19th chapter of Luke. This was not one of his disciples. This was a publican. Here was a guy hated by the community because, generally speaking, I don't think Zacchaeus was a thief. There's nothing in the text that suggests that, but they were just known to be thieves. They worked for the hated Romans. They were despised by their fellow Jews. And it's not shocking to me that Zacchaeus would want to see Jesus. It might shock us if we didn't know the Lord that Jesus would have any time for a fellow like Zacchaeus. But he did. And he saw him up there in the tree, and he said, come down, I've got to be at your house today. And he honors Zacchaeus with his presence. And so I just think about how the Lord would look at a man like that, and he would say, there's good in that man, and there are great things he can do. We got to find a way to let charity help us to see more than the worst in people. And I'm talking to myself here. Well, we have a few minutes left. Let me quickly mention some things that charity forbids, and the lesson will be yours. Charity, I think, forbids the whole spirit of rivalry. I think that applies or is seen in several of these phrases. Back in our text in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4, charity envieth not. To envy is the idea of to be upset by and to resent the success of other people. Charity envies not. It's always about rivalry, isn't it? C.S. Lewis, I think it was, who wrote in his book Mere Christianity about pride. He said, pride is never proud of being rich or being good looking, being successful. Pride is about being richer than, more good looking than, more successful than. It's always a rivalry. There's always competition. And what charity does, it takes out the competition. It doesn't bring me down because somebody else does well. And that spirit of envy is just straight from the devil. It vaunts not itself, which is another way of saying it does not boast, it does not sing its own praises, as we sometimes say. It is not puffed up, swelled up with pride. Seeks not her own. It's not about the competition. You remember that passage in James 3? James contrasts two kinds of wisdom, you remember in this passage. There's a wisdom from above that's first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated. But before this, he had talked about the wisdom that is earthly and sensual and devilish. And he described this devilish kind of thinking as bitter envying, verse 14, and strife in your hearts. The rivalry. I've got to step on somebody else to be taller. It's always about I've got to get ahead of somebody else. That kind of spirit will destroy the unity of anybody. The Lord certainly fought against that with his own disciples. In Matthew chapter 20, a very memorable passage, when we find the sons of Zebedee coming to Jesus and saying, we want to sit one on the right hand, one on the left. Excuse me. When you come in your kingdom. And his response to that was, you don't understand the first thing about what it means to be great. Verse 25, the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them. And they that are great exercise authority over them. But I say to you, it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister, your servant. Whoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered to, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. He had to teach them that over and again. In fact, the very night he was betrayed, John 13, this unforgettable scene there, they're still at odds with each other about who's the greatest. And that's when the Lord, without saying another word, he puts aside his outer garment, he takes a towel, he takes a bowl of water, and he begins to do the work of a servant and wash their feet. Peter and Andrew and James and John, well, he tried to go to Peter. Did Judas, I'm sure. He tried to go to Peter, and Peter said, you're not washing my feet. Because that's not what big men do. And Jesus said, you don't understand the first thing about being a big man. No matter how many times he told him, that patience came in to play here. But look there in John 3, in verse 12, he said, John 13, in verse 12 it should be. He said, you see what I've done for you. You call me Master and Lord. You say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. I have given you an example that you should do as I've done to you. This is not authorizing the ritual of foot washing. It is instead saying, if you can serve your brother, there's no job you're too good to do. Because that's what charity is about, helping people in the way that they need. And there's no pride in that. Charity also forbids a hot temper. Back to our text. It's not easily provoked. Sometimes that is translated is not irritable, is not touchy. Literally, sharpness of spirit. You know, being touchy is a choice. You ever know some touchy people? Don't point. You ever know some touchy people? Let me tell you, that's a choice. I'm not born that way. I don't have to be that way. I quit being that way. Charity will demand that I quit being that way. Do not behave unseemly. Literally, the idea is not according to form or shapeless. I think this is where we get that expression, talk about being bent out of shape. You ever heard that? Literally, that's the idea here. Don't get bent out of shape. It's unbecoming, it's shameful, it's disgraceful, unseemly behavior. It does not fit the picture of charity. And if we had more time, we'd look at some examples from the Lord's life of this very thing. I want to mention one more thing. Charity forbids being bitter. Charity thinks no evil. What does that mean? I don't think he's saying there be pure-minded in the broadest sense of the term. The word here, logizomai, is a big old word, but you see the word log in it. And that the idea is of keeping a log, a journal, a record. And what he says is that charity is the opposite of that spirit that keeps a record. As one translation puts it, takes no account of evil. Another says, do not keep record of wrongs. You ever known somebody who had that spirit? I'm going to mark that down. I'm going to remember that. And he will. Let me tell you, if he lives to be 120, he's going to remember that day when somebody said something. But that's not charity. The idea of I'm going to keep a record so I can get everybody back I don't want God to do that to me. And I better not do that to other people. Charity forbids it. Charity does not rejoice in iniquity. As Moffat put it, love is never glad when others go wrong. Yeah, I knew that's happened to him. That's the way he's going. Yep. If I can't shed a tear for that guy, I don't have the spirit I need to have. A fellow may go wrong and he may pay for it, but that's not a happy day. He's never glad when wrong is done. Sometimes people, wicked people are wicked to other wicked people. There's no good in that. That's all a sad situation. We'll leave it with the Lord after that. We don't rejoice at iniquity. There's no malice in the Spirit of Christ. And if you're looking for a divine example of that, we think about Romans chapter 5. Christ had no malice, no bitterness. Excuse me. In fact, he says here, when we were without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. Scarcely for a righteous man will one die. Maybe for a good man some would dare to die. But God commends his love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. There's no bitterness in those whose hearts have the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of charity. Though I speak with the tongue of men and angels and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profits me nothing. Charity suffers long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunts not itself, is not puffed up, does not behave itself unseemly, seeks not her own, is not easily provoked, thinks no evil, rejoices not in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Charity never fails. Now abide faith, hope, and charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. I'll say this one last thing. If I listen to this lesson and I'm thinking about all the folks that need it, I've missed the point. This lesson is for me. And I hope all of us take it that personally, so that we might truly be devoted to being what Christ would have us to be. I appreciate the kind way you listen. Please get out your songbooks, turn to the number that's been selected. If it be your desire, even tonight, to obey the gospel of Christ, or as a child of God, if you need to come back to Him, do so, and don't delay. And if we can help you in some way, let us know how. Right now, while we stand and sing, will you come?